Hello and welcome to the Classics Book Club. This is a place to come and delve into all those classics you always wanted to read. And today we'll be chatting about one of the all-time classics, The Pickwick Papers by Charles Dickens. I'd like to firstly welcome Susannah Fullerton as our resident Queen of the Classics. Susannah has been president of the Jane Austen Society of Australia for the past 19 years. She's also patron of the Kipling Society of Australia, a founding member of the New South Wales Dickens Society and the Australian Bronte Association, and a member of the Dylan Thomas Society of Australia. Susannah is Sydney's best-known lecturer on classic novels, and she lectures regularly at the Art Gallery of New South Wales. Welcome, Susannah.
Hi.
I'd also like to welcome Leslie Rickman from YouTube channel Words of a Reader, and a warm welcome to New South Wales Dickens Society member Jeff Usher.
Hi.
We'll be joined very shortly by Louise Owens, who is also a member of the New South Wales Dickens Society, and she's author of the book lovers blog of choice, readmeblogSite.net. And of course, we'd also like to welcome back all our book club members watching on our Hangout on Air. And don't forget to pop any questions or comments, and we'll do our best to get to them during the Hangout. And now to the book. The travelling society formed by the Pickwick Club of London comprises of 4 members. Mr. Pickwick, the businessman and philosopher. Mr. Tracy Tupman is a ladies' man who never quite makes a conquest. Mr. Augustus Snodgrass, the poet who has never written a poem. And Nathaniel, not-so-thrilling sportsman with no medals or awards. So quite the foursome. And as the society travels around the country, we follow their escapades and hijinks in one of Charles Dickens' most humorous literary works. Susannah, tell us about the Pickwick Papers.
Well, the book was the one that made Dickens famous. He was asked to write a bit of a tale to go with some sporting prints, showing gentlemen whose sporting adventures were never very successful. And so he began to write the story of the 4 members of the Pickwick Club. This was published initially in 1836. It went through into 1837 in monthly installments. And to begin with the first printing of the first chapter, 400 copies were printed of the Pickwick Papers. And the novel sort of appeared over the next few months, and it didn't make much of an impression on anybody. It was illustrated by different people as time went on, and it was not a great success. And then Dickens, in chapter 10, introduced a character called Sam Weller. He's the person who blacks the boots at the inn. He's a Cockney. He speaks in true Cockney fashion. And from the moment that Sam Weller appeared, the book took off. Everybody started rushing around trying to get the first chapters of the book to find out what they had missed. And by the time the last installment of the Pickwick Papers came out in 1837, Dickens was a household name. Pickwick mania had struck Britain. People could buy Pickwick games, Pickwick prints to put on their walls, Pickwick capes, Pickwick coats, Pickwick snuff boxes, Pickwick song books, Pickwick joke books. Judges were seen reading Pickwick during intervals on the bench. Doctors would snatch a little bit between patients. Everybody was crazy about the Pickwick Papers. And so by the time Dickens finished that and brought it out as a novel, he was famous, and he could command great prices for his next novel, which of course was Oliver Twist. And so the Pickwick Papers was what made Dickens's name. And from then, of course, he just went from strength to strength. So what we need to do tonight is to look at this as the first Dickens novel. How typically Dickensian is this book? And is it a great favourite? For many people, this is a Dickens novel they have not read. So, Jeff, do you think it's a typically Dickensian novel, that it shows the author he would go on to be?
There are certainly some aspects of it that are real preludes to the rest of his career, and it's kind of his descriptive ability. One lovely piece towards the end of the book, chapter 51, in which Mr. Pickwick encounters an old acquaintance and so on, but it begins with a description of the weather, just one paragraph. The morning which broke upon Mr. Pickwick's sight at 8 o'clock was not at all calculated to elevate his spirits or to lessen the depression which the unlooked-for result of his embassy inspired. The sky was dark and gloomy, The air was damp and raw, the streets were wet and sloppy. The smoke hung sluggishly above the chimney tops as if it lacked the courage to rise, and the rain came slowly and doggedly down as if it had not even the spirit to pour. A gamecock in the stable yard, deprived of every spark of his accustomed animation, balanced himself dismally on one leg in a corner. A donkey, moping with a drooping head under the narrow roof of an outhouse, appeared from his meditative and miserable countenance to be contemplating suicide. In the street, umbrellas were the only things to be seen, and the clicking of pattens and splashing of raindrops were the only sounds to be heard. And I remember that's sweet. When I was rereading it just recently, I thought, that's got to be on air. That he can capture the miserable weather.
Yes.
And so many of his scenes, he describes the fog creeping into every chink and keyhole, out on the moors, and so on. He's got a real thing about fog, of course.
Yeah.
Of course, London at the time was pretty foggy.
Yeah.
But it's a wonderful descriptive power, and that comes through all of his books.
Yes, yes. So it is there right from the very beginning with the Pickwick Papers. And Dickens, the houses and the inns and the food that gets... This is a wonderful book about food. The character is always eating. There's a lovely line when you hear that Mr. Pickwick was deeply investigating the contents of a pigeon pie. And you can just see him eating that pie and enjoying it. What do you think, Leslie, about this as a sort of typical Dickens novel? Or do you think he got much better as he went on? Or how do you rate this novel amongst the works of Dickens?
It's very different from everything else that I've read by Dickens, but I do find that his characterization is very typically Dickens. It's not entirely believable characters, but very fleshed out anyhow, and just so lovely, just lovely descriptions of the characters, what they wear, how they speak. I feel like he always has that thing where he just paints the picture so vividly in your mind of who these people are and what they're about.
Letitia, it's not your favourite Dickens, I believe.
I have to agree with Leslie. I think, you see the foundation of who Dickens is as a writer in this book. But, I mean, the things that I love in all these other books are the darkness and the real sort of, darker moments of humanity that you find in things like Bleak House. And that you find in Great Expectations, which are two of my favourite novels. I just find that that's not here at all, and so it's very foreign to me because the things that I passionately love about Dickens seem very absent in this. But I did enjoy the crazy characters. But I must admit that after a while, the hijinks started to sort of go on too long.
Yes, yes. I do think that Mr. Jingle is a very irritating character. I find him rather hard to believe, the way he speaks. And it's sort of quite funny to begin with, but I do find it gets a bit tiresome after a while. And the fat boy, I mean, when I first read it, I couldn't believe that anybody could fall asleep as often as the fat boy. But I believe that there's actually a medical condition named after, sort of Pickwickian syndrome or something, named after the problems that the fat boy has actually got. And they're not, they do happen. So perhaps Dickens is not being as unrealistic as I think he is there. But do you find Mr. Jingle irritating?
Yes.
You mentioned the darker side of Dickens, and we certainly don't get that in the first half of the novel. But what about in the second part of the novel, when we've got all the legal stuff with Dodson and Fogg and Mr. Pickwick actually going to prison? That is a darker part of the novel, and I think we see Dickens's interest in crime and prison reform coming through very strongly there.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it does come through, towards the end, definitely.
Jeff, what are your thoughts on the criminal aspects of this novel?
Dodson and Fogg are a wonderful couple.
Yes.
and against them is little Mr. Perker, who's beautifully named Perky Perker, you know, who thinks that Dodson and Fogg are such good lawyers. They're wonderful examples of their profession because they're so sharp. He has this great admiration of them. The prison scenes, of course, are a prelude to other prison scenes, and I've never quite understood why Mr. Pickwick is so determined to go to prison on a matter of principle. But I think, okay, that's his bent. But the prison scenes themselves are interesting. But, you know, there's obviously the kind of prison society and the hierarchy and the way that things can be obtained, and the money in the prison. This is a debtor's prison.
Yes.
People are buying things, and you think, where's this money coming from? And what's the economy within the prison?
And of course, Dickens knew all about that from his own father being in the Marshalsea prison for debt.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
he's writing about what he knows, but it's a shameful prison. I mean, you know, as you say, money can buy everything except opening the door and letting you out. So, yeah, the prison scenes are very interesting ones, I think, in the book.
Yeah.
What about women in this novel? I think women, on the whole, come off fairly badly. You know, people like Mrs. Bardell, who you know, pretends that Pickwick is making her an offer. You know, Mrs. Weller and some of the female characters don't really come off too well. So, what are your views on some of the women in the novel, Leslie? Do you think any stand out, or is this much more a book about male characters?
I often feel like Dickens wasn't the biggest fan of women. I find that in a lot of his novels, I don't love the female characters. They're often silly, frivolous, or unkind, and yeah, they're not particularly fleshed out characters in this at all. So.
Yeah. They don't really come alive, and Tracy Tupman tries to make love to all these different females, but you know, they're not very terribly convincing, a lot of them.
The one really nice female character in this one is the pretty little housemaid Mary.
Yes.
Sam, yeah, she actually is real.
She is, yes.
Although she suffers from the adjective little, which Dickens uses throughout his novels for his female characters.
Yes.
But the pretty housemaid becomes a real character for me. Yeah, I can picture her as a very attractive, very sensible, straightforward young woman. And I'm always, you know, pleased when Pickwick appoints her as housekeeper on condition that she marry Sam Weller, which she does without demur.
Like a good, obedient Dickensian female. Now let's look at the Wellers, because of course it was Sam Weller who made this novel the popular success that it was. And we get his wonderful father, Tony Weller, and I think one interesting aspect is that Sam Weller has the same name as his employer, Sam Pickwick.
Yes.
And I think that made many English people feel that there was a sort of bond, that there was a community, the class barriers were perhaps being broken down a little bit. Here were these two men who were both Sam, and they could really relate to Sam Weller because he spoke like they did. And Dickens was really doing something quite new with putting the Cockney dialect into a novel. Do you find it hard to read? Do you find it difficult, you know, reading all the Cockney dialect and the V's and the W's that seem to be the other way round? And is that an off-putting part of the novel for a modern reader, while it was so popular for a contemporary reader?
I don't find it too bad. It's certainly not as irritating as John Brodie, the strong Yorkshire. Now, I was in Yorkshire for nearly 20 years and got used to some of the Yorkshire accent and the dialect, but Dickens's rendition of Yorkshire always grated with me.
Okay.
Where the Wellers, I can kind of cope with it. If you read it phonetically aloud, it works.
Yes. And that, of course, was the way that so many of the first readers got the Pickwick Papers. It was read aloud to them by somebody who could afford the monthly part. Many of those first readers couldn't read. So somebody read it aloud, and they'd have got the genuine Cockney accent as it was read to them. So I think that must have hugely increased the appeal. Leslie, do you like Sam and his father as characters? Are you pleased when you get to them in the book, or did they pall a little bit after a while?
I do really actually like them, but I find that the Pickwick Papers in general is something that I prefer dipping in and out of instead of reading large sections. So if I've read several parts with them in one sitting, then I am less inclined to enjoy their appearances, but I do in general like them.
Yes.
But it is also a book that you can dip in and out of.
Very much so. Hi, Louise. Welcome.
Oh, there's Louise.
We're talking about dipping into the Pickwick Papers. Is this a book that one should dip into, or should one start at page 1 and continue through to the end?
That's a really good question. I think you need to start at the beginning and go to the end, because there are a lot of characters that are introduced, and you might not pick up the thread. You really need to start at the beginning. Having said that, because it was serialized, you know, obviously Dickens was relying on everybody, not necessarily having read every single one in the way that he'd set out.
Mm.
And he quite often refers to what he has already written.
Yes, he does, yes.
As previously described, and so on.
And yet, this was his first effort at serial writing, and he does it wonderfully.
Yeah.
So did you enjoy the novel, Louise?
I loved it. I absolutely loved it. I thought it was fascinating. I loved the fact that I knew that this is what made Dickens famous, and I knew what was going on in his life at that time. So I thought that was intriguing. I thought, I mean, what an imagination. It also made me think of many other writers who must have been inspired by, especially Samuel Vella, and his strong personality, and indeed his father. Yeah.
Yes. This is also a novel, I think, that reflects Dickens's great love of travel, because, of course, the Pickwickians are always on the move. Now, they start off from Rochester, a place Dickens knew well from his childhood, and where he actually sets the very last novel that he would write, The Mystery of Edwin Drood. And the characters go out from the Bull Inn in Rochester and set off on their wonderful travels, going through Kent. Mr. Pickwick climbs the castle tower at Rochester, which I have done as well, so I've seen the view that he describes. And, of course, they go to Bath and have adventures there. And the name Pickwick was actually the name of there's a village just outside of Bath called Pickwick. So possibly Dickens picked up the name there. And in Bath, Samuel Weller tastes that water, that famous Bath mineral water, and describes it as tasting like warm flat irons, which is a wonderful description. But I think the travel is a big part of the novel, isn't it? It's a big part of the appeal, because it's always moving on somewhere and you're meeting new characters, and yet the old characters crop up in unexpected places. So were there any particular locations that you all enjoyed?
I always felt as though I needed a map to work out who was where, when, and they leap in a coach, and 12 hours later they're somewhere, and then there's a long stay somewhere else, and who's going where, in which direction, at what time.
Yeah.
I love the Bath section. I thought that was great fun.
Yes.
Taking the walk.
Bath. Yes. Yeah. And amongst the Pickwickians, do you have a favourite? Mr. Winkle, Mr. Snodgrass, Mr. Tupman, or Mr. Pickwick himself? Who appealed most? Pickwick?
I do love him.
He's sort of a universal father to everybody, isn't he? He tries so hard to do good, and but would any of us females have fallen into the capacious arms of Mr. Tracy Tupman? No.
No thanks.
Leslie, did you have a favourite?
I think I have a soft spot for all of them, but I actually quite like Snodgrass just for his ridiculousness. I quite enjoy his lack of poetry.
Yes. Poet who never writes any.
I like Winkle's complete inability to admit that he can't do something.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Full of confidence, but not actually any actual ability. Yeah. And the language of this book. I mean, I don't know how much the Pickwick Papers is read by modern readers, but if this was somebody's first Dickens, do you think they would find it somewhat daunting and perhaps not want to go on and read more? How did you find the language of the book? Letitia, you found it a bit heavy going in places.
Yeah, it wasn't so much the language. I think, I have to be honest, if this was the first Dickens book I picked up, I'm not sure I would have picked up another. If I thought that that's what they were all like.
Yeah, okay.
And that's, I know, controversial. But yeah, I think I didn't find the language difficult, and I thought that it was definitely accessible, and I think he still writes in such an amazing style and so captivating, and as Leslie had pointed out earlier, the characters are so well formed, and you just, you want to sort of read it because the language is so beautiful. But yeah, just overall, it
just wasn't your favourite Dickens.
Yeah.
And I mean, some of the language is just, it flows so beautifully. The description of the election at Eatanswill, which itself is a wonderful name, Eatanswill.
Well,
and the Honourable Samuel Slumpke and Horatio Firkin, Esquire of Firkin Lodge, Fiskin Lodge. The play of these two candidates, the blues and the buffs. Once you get into that, it's a beautiful description of the electioneering on the hustings.
Yes. And how corrupt it was.
Yeah.
I thought it had lots of the makings of the Dickens work that we know. After that, the characterization, the social comments, but I didn't think it was typical of his work that we know. It's much more light-hearted, I think, than the social commentary and the really cleverly crafted storylines of his later work.
I commented before the session about the fact that it includes several short stories that are almost irrelevant to the rest of the story. The Bagman story, for example.
Yes.
It's just there.
It's a picturesque novel, and one of Dickens's favourite novels was Don Quixote, the story of a man who sets off with his faithful servant to have adventures, and who's perhaps a bit of an idealist who doesn't see the real world quite as practically as he should. And in many ways, this novel is Dickens's version of Don Quixote, as Mr. Pickwick, the idealist who is not aware of the lures of women and other people, Mr. Jingles and the like, sets off with his very faithful servant to have adventures.
Yeah.
Stories get added, and different people appear and then disappear, and there's different festivities and adventures, and they sort of end up pretty much back where they started, with the odd marriage or two along the way. So it really is his version of Don Quixote, I think.
The other thing is that it starts with this device that it's based on the notes.
Yes.
That they had in their notebooks and pencils and so on and so on. And eventually that is just dropped.
Yes.
And Dickens tells the story as a storyteller himself, not through the notes that he refers to in the early chapters.
Do you think he just found it too clumsy, sticking to those notes, and just wanted to get on with telling the story?
Yeah,
yes. Yeah, because he doesn't use that.
I do find it impressive that he was so young writing older characters so believably.
Yes, yes. And just made such a hit with it. Elizabeth Gaskell, in her novel Cranford, when it was being published in serial form, greatly upset Dickens because she has a character called Captain Brown who is so busy reading the latest installment of the Pickwick Papers that he fails to notice a train is coming, and he's run over and killed by the train. And Dickens wasn't at all happy about that. But that people were totally absorbed by this novel, and many people have remained so since. There's that lovely scene in Louisa May Alcott's Little Women where the girls pretend to be the 4 gentlemen of the Pickwick Club and act out scenes. It's a novel that's had an enormous impact, even if it's not the most read Dickens novel today. And somebody was mentioning the film version. Was it you, Louise? Did you enjoy the film version, the BBC version?
That wasn't me.
Was it Leslie?
No, I haven't seen adaptation, actually.
Oh, okay. There is an old BBC adaptation, which I forget when it came out, but quite some time ago.
I've never seen it.
I've seen a cartoon version.
Yes, okay.
The other thing is, Mr. Pickwick is emblematic of men of the time. If you show anybody now a picture of Mr. Pickwick, they'll recognise it.
Absolutely, yes.
Character. The clothing, the tights and the gaiters, the rather protuberant stomach, which was a sign of good living and good food.
Bit of thumb punch and
he is just absolutely one of the most recognisable characters in literature.
Well, I think we can all definitely agree that the Pickwick Papers was the start of the Charles Dickens that we know and love, whether we like this book or not. I want to thank you all so much for being here for our first Classics Book Club, and there will be many more. And in fact, we'd like to let everyone know that next month on the 24th of March, we will be reading Agnes Grey by Anne Bronte, which will be very exciting because I'm a huge Bronte fan, so I'm very excited about reading that. Louise, Steph, Susannah and Leslie, I want to thank you so much for being here today.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for watching the Classics Book Club on the Pickwick Papers.
Thank you.